Michael Morell, welcome to The Unfair Fight.
It's great to be with you, John. You know, that's a much cooler introduction than I have for my podcast.
Oh, well, you deserve a way cooler intro than ours. I've watched yours. It's a lot better. But I've been looking forward to this conversation since we inked this a while ago. You know, you're an absolute legend in the intelligence community. Obviously, I was just a peon when I was in there, but we were always working to put the best operations we could on because I knew they would either get approved by you at some point or pass through you. So much appreciated for all your service to the country.
Thanks. It's great to be with you.
Awesome. So, you know, obviously you've had a long career in the intelligence community, but the one story I never heard was how'd you get in to CIA? What made you want to be an intelligence officer, analyst? I mean, because you had a slightly different path than a lot of the folks that get to the top at CIA.
Yeah. So unlike many kids today, I had no passion. I had no desire to work for CIA or the IC. When I was in college, I started college wanting to go to law school, though I decided to major in political science because that's what everybody else seemed to be doing who wanted to go to law school. I took a class in economics as part of that political science degree, and I fell in love with economics. Absolutely fell in love with it. I thought it not only explained the economy, but it explained human behavior as well. And so I switched my major, and throughout my 4 years of college, I said, I want to go to grad school, I want to get a PhD, and I want to teach. So that was my plan. I had a professor who I think did some work for CIA. He died early in life, so I was not able to figure that out. But he encouraged me to send a resume. At that point, you did send resumes to CIA, so I did. And they invited me to Washington for 2 days, and I had never been to Washington, D.C.
Where were you coming from? Ohio, right?
Lower middle class kid from Ohio, right?
Okay.
Never been to Washington. So I get invited, and I say, look, I'm going to grad school, but sure, I'll go see the nation's capital, right, on the taxpayer's dime.
Right.
So I go, and I have 5 interviews each day. And I'm really blown away by 3 things. I'm blown away by the mission, right, of collecting and analyzing information and presenting it to policymakers in an objective way that's free of politics and free of a policy bias, right? I mean, that was very attractive to me.
Right.
And then the capabilities that they could talk to me about, you know, which weren't significant, but the capabilities they could talk to me about kind of blew me away. And then most important, the people I met blew me away.
Right.
They were not what I expected. You know, they were normal human beings, right?
Right.
They were nice. There was this as you know, right, this incredibly strong sense of family that you could just feel. And the second day, everybody said to me, you know, this grad school thing you keep talking about that you told everybody about yesterday? Well, if you come work here, we'll send you to grad school. Right. You can go to, as soon as you start, you can go to grad school at night. We'll pay for it. And if things work out for you, you know, if you do a good job, then we'll send you back full time, pay your salary, pay your tuition, and you can, you know, work on your PhD. So I said yes. I never looked back. By the way, they lived up to that commitment to send me back to school. And, you know, and those first couple of years is when I absolutely fell in love with the place. And that's not too strong a word. You know, I tell people that I looked forward to Mondays, not Fridays. You know, there wasn't a single day in my 33-year career where I didn't want to go to work. Right? How many people can say that? So I was just very, very, very lucky.
That's incredible. You know, I remember my time. Obviously, I was up the 95 at NSA, but I worked extremely closely with you guys and had a lot of experience over the years. And I've always just been, I think this is one of the things that always bothered me when I hear deep state and all the, you know, kind of conspiracy theories. I was like, if you actually worked with the folks in the agency, you'd realize these are your neighbors.
Right.
Like, right. That's one thing. And sometimes the government's a little too disorganized to actually conspire properly. And like, I know we always want to hold it at the highest regard, but I found the mission driven culture. We loved working with the CIA folks.
Yeah.
They were just absolutely fantastic. What made you stay? I mean, obviously, if you love the job, that's a pretty obvious answer. But you know, and could you talk a little bit about as much? Obviously, we don't want to talk about anything we shouldn't. But
sure,
there's different core roles that you can play as an employee there, and I think it'd be generally we've noticed when you move up to the upper ranks, you went through more the case officer route, and I think you had a little bit of different path, and which shows you there's more ways to do this. And I think it'd be fascinating for the audience to hear a little bit more
Sure.
without giving anything away,
Sure.
obviously.
So there's three key missions at CIA, right? One is the reason the place was created, which was all source analysis.
Right.
It turns out that the United States of America had all the information it needed to have seen Pearl Harbor coming, but there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a single organization whose responsibility was to pull all that information together and make sense of it. So that's why Harry Truman created CIA. So it was created to do what I grew up doing, which was all source analysis. And then, of course, it also collects um, intelligence clandestinely, which is another function. And the third is covert action. So the president, diplomacy is not enough, and military action is too much. And there's this thing in the middle called covert action, which is designed to actually not understand facts on the ground, but actually to change the facts on the ground.
Right.
And the agency, is a big place. Think of Fortune 200 company sized place, with a worldwide presence, and it hires all sorts of people. But the three key sorts of people it hires are analysts, who have critical thinking skills, operations officers who have incredibly strong interpersonal skills,
Right.
and then scientists and engineers, right, who are incredibly innovative and creative.
Right.
And we can compete with the place you used to work, right, for those kind of people.
Oh, there's no question.
Yeah. So I grew up on the analyst side,
Right.
and I grew up doing East Asia.
Okay.
So I did a little bit of Southeast Asia, I did a little bit of China, I did a little bit of Japan, and I did a lot of Korea.
Right.
So I was actually very small part of, I was still very, very junior. I was part of the team that identified the North Korean nuclear program.
Really?
When we first discovered it. Yeah. Small part of the team, but mostly Asia. And then I started a series of staff jobs. So I ran the staff that produces the president's daily brief.
Right.
And then I was George Tenet's, when he was the director of Central Intelligence, I was his executive assistant.
Okay.
And then I was George Bush's first daily intelligence briefer. And then I served overseas as the liaison between the CIA analysts and British intelligence analysts. So I did all these kind of offline jobs, right, where I learned a tremendous amount. And when we came back from London, Mike Hayden made me his number 3. And then I ran the analytics side of the agency, and then I ended up as the deputy director under Leon Panetta and General Petraeus and John Brennan.
Oh, it's fascinating career. It's interesting when you start in the analyst side and you start rising up the ranks, you really get to see a lot, right? You get to see kind of the power. And that's one thing I think a lot of folks don't know outside the community is not every agency, at least when I was there, maybe it's changed, has the authority to actually do all source analysis where you can take not only your human drive data, but your SIG and ELINT and all your other INT forms and put together to try and, develop, let's say, a national intelligence estimate or something, something like that.
Exactly right.
You talked about being on the PDB team, and then eventually being President Bush's briefer. And one thing that obviously I know, and it's been reported on quite a bit, but I'm not sure our audience has learned a lot about it. You're actually with President Bush on that trip the day 9/11 happened. Talk to us about that. I mean, that had to have been a wild sense of, emotions and, kind of, did you know exactly who was behind it, right? Immediately, did you think?
Yeah. So, the day is seared in my memory. I mean, literally, I could walk you through every second of the day. But if I were going to sum it up, John, I'd say that it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So, a couple of examples of the intensity. So, after we left Sarasota and we were flying around the Gulf of Mexico, not sure where we were going to go, the president asked to see me in what is actually a pretty small office on Air Force One. And so it was the president, it was me, and it was his chief of staff, Andy Card. President looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" And I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence that would take us to a perpetrator, but I would bet my children's future that when we get to the end of the trail here, we're going to find Al Qaeda and we're going to find Osama bin Laden. And then he looked me in the eye again and he said, "When will we know?" Which is the kind of question a president asks you, for which there's not an answer, right? And so I did something. I reached back into my analytic toolkit, because one of the things you're taught as an analyst is context is everything.
Right.
So I gave him context. So I said, Mr. President, the East Africa bombings, it took us 2 days to figure out it was Al Qaeda. The bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, it took us 3 months to figure out that it was Al Qaeda.
Right.
The bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, it took us a year to figure out the Iranians were behind that. So, Mr. President, it may come soon, and then again, it may take some time, right? So I gave him that context. I think the second example of the intensity is when we were flying back to Andrews that night, the CIA sent me a single human report. So from a human spy that a European intelligence service had given us. And, because another service had given us this, had no idea who the source was, had no idea how good the source was, had no idea how the source got the information.
Right.
But this thing said that what happened this morning would be the first of 2 waves of attacks against the United States. So I showed that to the president, right? And here's the guy who just suffered the worst attack in American history on the homeland, and here his intelligence briefer is showing him a piece of intelligence that says, it may happen again.
There's more coming.
Yeah, so that's an example of the intensity. Example of the surreal. When we were on final approach that night to Andrews, the president's military aide was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft, and he and I had become friends the previous 9 months. He actually once left the nuclear football in a car with me while he ran in to get something. So it's sitting next to me, right? And I have it. So he and I became friends, but he's looking at the windows on the left side of the aircraft, and he sees me looking at him and he waves me over. And the lights were dimmed, inside. Right. Some people had their eyes closed. And I go over and I look out, and there's an F-16 on the wingtip. And he said, it's an F-16. It's from the D.C. Air National Guard. There's another one on the other wingtip. And John, this plane was so close that you could see the pilot, you could see the pilot's facial features, and you could see the pilot looking at us. And in the distance, you could see the still burning Pentagon. Then the military aide said something to me that literally, I just got shivers up my back right now. Literally still send shivers up my back. He said, "Do you know why they're there?" I had no idea, right? Because every commercial plane had been grounded, right? So the only planes in the air were military planes. And I said, "No." And he said, "They're there in case someone fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach. Their job would be to put themselves between that missile and the President of the United States."
Unbelievable. Yeah. That would definitely go into the surreal moment. Wow. Yeah. I never knew the final approach. You could see the Pentagon still burning. If that didn't crystallize what was about to unfold over the next, decade plus, I don't know what does.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. So obviously you were, with the White House at one of the obviously country trajectory and course changing moments in history that led us on a global campaign for quite some time. Fast forward to the bin Laden operation. I believe at that time you were deputy director under Leon Panetta, and then acting director after that, right?
Yes.
When he left. What was the most memorable moment of that operation, or that whole experience, I would say, that you went through? Because we know the operation was how it culminated, but there's a whole lot of work that happened prior to that.
Yeah, so I think I think a lot of people think it must be right the moment that we got him, right? And that wasn't for me, because I wasn't involved in that, right? The SEALs did that. I was watching it, but that wasn't me. I think for me there were 2 moments. The first happened in August of 2010. Mm-hmm. So, several months, 9 months earlier, which is when the head of our counterterrorism center came to Director Panetta and to me and said, "I need to see you 2 alone."
Right.
Which was unusual. And so we go into the director's office, and he starts talking about this guy named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, who we did not know who this guy was.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave us the history, and he said, we found this guy. And, the history was he could be a courier for bin Laden. He said, we found this guy. We trailed him to his house, and he started showing us satellite photographs of the house, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the house, and there's 12 to 18-foot walls topped with barbed wire. There's 2 gates to get in the house. The house has very few windows. There's a 3rd floor balcony, but there's a privacy wall around the balcony. So it just jumps out at you that there's something incredibly unusual about this house.
Right.
So that was, and nobody said at that meeting that bin Laden might be there.
Really? It was all just kind of no one had wanted to say it.
The analysts are very careful, right? I mean,
right.
Just because you found a potential courier doesn't mean you found the courier. And even if you found the courier, maybe you still need to have him take you to bin Laden, right? And bin Laden somewhere else. But, the hair in the back of my neck stood up, right? As this is a possibility. So that was one moment. And then the second moment was actually after the operation. So people don't know this, but the first person that President Obama called when we were certain that we got bin Laden was President Bush.
Unbelievable.
And that's incredibly gracious, right? And then the other thing he did that was gracious was President Obama, knowing that I was with President Bush on 9/11, asked me to go to Dallas and brief the president on the whole operation. So I took the lead analyst, and I took the JSOC J3 person who planned the operation with me, and we spent 2.5 hours with the president in his office in Dallas. And he was like a kid in the candy shop. He wanted to know every single detail. And he actually, he's got an amazing memory, and he remembered some of the details that had occurred during his presidency because Mike Hayden had told him about them, right? And at the end of the briefing, 2 things happened. One is he said, Laura and I were going to go to the movies tonight, but this is better than any movie you could ever possibly see, so we're staying home. And then the other thing he did was he had given me some of his challenge coins. I don't know if all your listeners know, but military units, right, have these challenge coins, and they exchange them, right? It's a big thing in the military.
Right.
And the president has challenge coins. And he has different kinds. He has the President of the United States challenge coin. He's got, White House challenge coin. He's got Camp David challenge coin. Well, he has a commander-in-chief challenge coin, which he had never given to me. So at the end of this meeting, he gets up, he goes over to his desk, and he pulls out 3 commander-in-chief challenge coins, and he gives one to each of us. And when he slaps it in my hand, he looks me in the eye, and I can see closure in his eyes for the first time.
That is unbelievable story. This is one I've never heard before. It's I think a lot of folks, the challenge coin, it's actually, we implemented this at our own business, for our SOC analysts to have a great safe, so we made our own kind of with a code on the back and things. But I have a director of NSA challenge coin right behind me and a SOCOM one, and you don't get paid. You don't do these jobs for how much money you're going to make, right? And so sometimes
you do it or how many challenge coins you get.
that recognition goes a long way, but I think it really helps build that kind of esprit de corps.
Sure does.
Wow, that is a fascinating series of experiences you've been able to go through. So fast forward to today.
Yeah,
we've gone through a pandemic. I don't think anyone saw coming. Obviously, we had a big event pulling out of Afghanistan. I think we've also seen some success against ISIS over the past several years, but now it feels like we're shifting into a lot more back to traditional. I know some want to call them near peers, but I think in some case we should give them the respect and call peer adversaries.
Absolutely, China. China's a peer adversary. It's not near peer, right?
I hated that term. When I saw that, I was like, that makes us, I kind of feel like many ways, and this is just my personal opinion, we have to be really, really smart with how we handle the geopolitical dynamics now. Because in a way, when Japan attacked us, with Pearl Harbor, we didn't have a monstrous military, but we had a massive capacity to build and produce. And it was kind of that awakening the sleeping giant thing. And I look now, and while we still have a big ability to produce, I would argue China has a massive ability to produce armaments at scale. And I think the long-term, erosion of kind of our intellectual property has jump-started the ability for them to now truly innovate independently.
Absolutely.
I watched
Absolutely.
them target a small customer of ours, and they wanted to steal basically a design for an oil cooler. Sounds basic.
Yep.
But what people forget is you go down the supply chain where you can find some of these specialty parts that are the difference between having something great and not. And so, talk a little bit about, maybe let's start with Russia and Ukraine. We'll kind of
Yeah.
look at China at the end. Where do you? The thing that scares me is I don't see an exit strategy for Putin. He's leaned in so hard. How does this get unwound? I mean, I know that's a crystal ball collection, or kind of
Yeah. So
prediction.
I
But
think the way I think about it is that there's two wars going on here. Actually, there's a
Mhm.
there's a military war on the battlefield, and there is an economic war going
Right,
on. And the military war is going in our favor.
right,
Putin obviously failed miserably in what he was originally trying to do. He shifted his tactics. He was somewhat more successful, but then he got stuck.
right.
And he got stuck because he ran out of troops.
Mhm.
And he ran out of precision guided munitions. He can't import what he needs to make precision guided munitions. So he's having a very difficult time sustaining his operations, and it's so bad that he literally can't move forward. I
Right.
mean, he doesn't have what he needs. Some analysts believe it's going to take 10 years for Russia to rebuild its military to where it was. So when this thing started, John, there were 260,000 guys in the Russian army, right? Not the
Mhm.
Russian military, but the Russian army. And he put over 200,000 of those into Ukraine, and he's lost about 75,000 of them to either death or to injury
Or injury.
and to desertion and capture. And he's lost 75,000 of them
As in a short period of time.
in a short period of time. So he's out of Schlitz,
Right.
right? And what he's hoping for, what his hope is that Ukraine is not able to put together a counteroffensive that will drive him out of Ukraine before the winter. So he hopes he can get to the winter, and that's where the economic war kicks in, right? If you look at the economic war, yeah, Russia's hurting, right? There's no imports on the shelves anymore. The IKEA store in Moscow is
Right.
empty. Any sort of manufacturing that needs foreign parts is struggling. So Russia's GDP this year is going to be down 30%
Right.
from what it was last year. So Russia's hurting, but Ukraine's hurting much more.
Right.
So Ukraine's GDP is going to be down 50% this year, and it has a government budget gap of over $10 billion a month that the West is not filling. So the U.S. is helping a little bit on the budget gap, but not a lot.
Right.
People don't have a lot of money here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Budgets are tight all over the place. And so the Ukrainian economy is really hurting. And then you add on top of that, what's going to happen this winter with natural gas prices and the lack of natural gas in Europe?
Right.
Putin is hoping that it breaks apart NATO. I don't think it will,
Right.
but that's Putin's hope. So he hopes that the economic advantage that he has, and it's kind of interesting that he has an economic advantage given that he's the one who's been sanctioned, right?
Right.
Because he's making so much money off of oil here. He's hoping that the Ukrainians will want to negotiate a ceasefire come this winter. And he can stay where he is. He can, the lines will be where they are now,
Right.
which means he's gained something, right? And he can go back home and say, we won here. He can spin this as a victory, and then he can take time rebuilding his military and come back and fight later. That's what he wants. What
Interesting.
Zelensky wants is the West to give him the weapons and the money that he needs to be able to sustain this and actually put together a counteroffensive to drive the Russians out.
Right.
And what he needs more HIMARS.
Right.
So these, long range artillery. He needs something called ATACMS, which are even longer range artillery. But most important, he needs armor.
Right.
He needs tanks and armored personnel carriers if he's going to take back territory.
Right.
And I don't see the West giving that. One of the reasons we're not giving it is because our stockpiles are so low.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say is, I suspect a lot of just our munitions, I suspect are probably getting uncomfortably depleted.
Yeah, I talked to the guy in UCOM who's responsible for logistics, and he said, we have to keep enough. We have to keep enough weapons ourselves just in case, right? We can't run our stocks down to low levels that put us at risk. And then obviously we have other parts of the world to worry about, right? So it's really a statement about how our defense industrial base has eroded over the last 25, 30 years, that we're not able to ramp up to produce what Ukraine needs at this moment.
Right.
So I would suspect that this is going to be sort of a stalemate for the next 6 months.
Right.
Partisan activity is increasing, so behind the lines attacks on Russian forces, that's increasing.
Right.
But I suspect we're going to be here, and we'll get to the winter, and we'll see who's right about whether Europe holds together or not.
Wow. I sure hope they do. This is I think a pivotal moment in history where we can't get soft here.
One of the ways, I think you said something really important just now, John. Yeah. One of the ways to think about this, right, is my career at the agency was, I started in the Cold War, right? Great clarity, right? And then we had this 10-year period in the 1990s where we had no idea who our enemy was.
Right.
And there was complete lack of clarity, right? And then 9/11 happens, and we have 20 years of clarity again.
Right.
And now we're in this new world, right, where we are dealing with peer competitors, two peer competitors, right? Even Russia, for me, is a peer competitor because they have nuclear weapons, right?
Yeah, and they work.
And then China's there for a lot of reasons.
Right.
But we're in this new world now, and this is the first fight of this new world.
Right.
Right. And so how this fight ends, I think, is going to help determine what this new world looks like and how people think they can behave in it. Yeah. So I think this is incredibly important how Russia-Ukraine turns out.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, I think it's kind of a nice segue into, one of the things that, if you take a really big step back and look at some of the things that happened during the pandemic, just simple things like computer monitors were hard to get, laptops. We don't produce any phones over here. We might invent the chips, but we don't make them over here. Most of our generic prescription drugs are made overseas. The ones that our military uses. It almost feels to me like we need a Manhattan Project or moonshot effort to rebuild semiconductor manufacturing and, frankly, high-tech manufacturing, computers and prescription drugs, if nothing more. That's a complete national security requirement, because I feel like if we got into, and I hope we avoid it at all costs, and both sides do, but if we ever got into a scuffle with China, we'd be kind of Russia, where we're losing our ability to import raw materials at the scale we need to be able to sustain a war. And you look at the largest semiconductor manufacturer country is Taiwan, which is a little too close for comfort to have all that IP stacked there. Because, I'm concerned that we even have the capability to do it at scale anytime soon. I think we're years out.
Yeah, so we are way too dependent. Semiconductors are the best example, right? And unfortunately, when I think about dependency, the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, I actually put in the China column,
right?
Because I don't think we can defend Taiwan.
Right.
We can talk about that if you want, but I don't think we can defend Taiwan. So our dependency on semiconductors is huge. Our dependency on the inputs to pharmaceuticals, right, are huge. It's not a great place to be. Our industrial base's dependence on China is huge. The Trump administration did what was a very important study on our industrial base, and there was a classified version and an unclassified version. You can go to the DoD website and get the unclassified version, but its basic conclusion is that our industrial base is far, far from what it needs to be, and it's too dependent.
Right.
If you take apart a modern U.S. weapon system and lay all the pieces out, on the floor of a warehouse, and you said, okay, where do these different pieces come from? you'd be shocked at how many of them came from places that we don't want them to come from.
Right.
So we got a lot of work to do. We're just starting to recognize it, I think, right? CHIPS Act, right? Really important, I think. But
critical.
$50 billion is a drop in the bucket.
That's what I thought. To me, I was like, that's an epic underinvestment in something that's this critical.
Yeah. So think $50 billion for the whole United States government, and Samsung, which is one of the 3 big chip makers in the world, has a $250 billion R&D budget for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. Just one company. So we're recognizing the problem. We're recognizing we have to reduce dependency. But the government is just starting to figure out how to do that and is just starting to take steps. And unfortunately, politics here are not what they need to be.
Right.
I think we would all agree on that. Let's not blame anybody here, in particular, but they're not what they need to be, and that worries me more than anything else, because we can't make the decisions we need to make about national security unless we get our politics right.
Yeah, there's no question, because everyone's just trying to not give the other side a win, know. And it's hard to kind of progress with that mentality. Yeah,
exactly.
During your career, obviously, a big part of this show is kind of, cyber operations. We do defense for a living, but, during your career in the intelligence community, have you witnessed or experienced, a significant impact from, via the cyber domain, whether it's offensive, defensive operations? Like, do you think we're investing enough in our capabilities, both defensive, offensive? And the other question I would ask is, do you think the government is in a good position to really move the needle much on defense, or do they really need to enable a larger workforce and a more competent workforce to get there?
Yeah, it's great questions. So the answer on have I witnessed a significant impact? Yes, but I can't talk about it.
Okay, that's fair. All good.
Offensively, I think we're one of the best in the world.
Right.
I think you'd put Israel, the UK, the United States, all together, best in the world. The guys at NSA are amazing. The guys at Cybercom are amazing. So I think we're very, very good. I think there's policy issues around using those capabilities.
Yeah.
Right. So in the Obama administration, we had big debates around the sit room table as to whether you use offensive capabilities for defensive purposes. Right. And the ultimate answer was no, we're not going to do that. And the Trump administration reversed that, and the Biden administration has sustained that reversal. And I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. We protected the 2018 midterms, and we protected the 2020 presidential election from Russian interference by offensive cyber operations. By Cybercom, and I think that's the right thing to do. So I think we've had we've stayed on the cutting edge of the capabilities, and policy is slowly evolving in the right direction to be able to use those capabilities for our national security. Defensively, I think it's a different story. Does CIA and NSA do a good job protecting their networks? Absolutely. 100% confident of that. Does DoD? A little more difficult to say, right? But I don't think we're ever going to have a situation where the government is really there to help the private sector, right? If the private sector is waiting for the government to ride around the corner, on horses and arrive with the cyber solution, they're going to be waiting a long time. The government's just not positioned to do that. There are legal issues, as you know, about helping the private sector. So I think while there's been advances in that in terms of what's shared and what's not shared, it's largely a one-way street. And so I think it's up to the private sector itself. And when I left government, there was very little awareness in the private sector about the need for cybersecurity. There was in banks, there was in critical infrastructure, but outside of critical infrastructure, there wasn't. I joined the board of a company when I got out of government, and they didn't even have a CISO. They weren't focused. They didn't think they were a target. They didn't think they were a target. And then Target happens, and then
Right.
Sony happens, and a bunch of these attacks happen, and they start paying attention.
Right.
And now I think most companies are paying attention. I think we're on a journey, though, right, in terms of the sophistication of the protection that companies seek.
Right.
I think they need help figuring out how sophisticated it needs to be and what does it need to look like. I think one of the problems is there's so many cyber companies knocking on the door of these CISOs.
That's a problem.
Right?
Yeah.
And they just don't know, right?
Really hard
they just
to
don't
pick,
know. It
right?
really is, right?
Everyone claims the same thing. The one thing that I agree with you fully on the offensive side. One of the challenges with offensive cyber weapons, it's not like they explode once they're used, if that makes sense. So you always have to assume they will be reassembled, and eventually, even if it's the concept of the operation, you can put it to use, and you have to prepare to defend against that coming back at you.
Right.
And then on the defensive side, there's just physics in play. Like from a physical attack, right? Of course, the government and the military can step in, but the design of the internet and the way companies are connected to it and do commerce over it, I 100% agree with you. I think you cannot expect the government to come around the corner to save you, because the reality is you have to run software on the endpoint computers to actually be good at this. And, just doing it at the network level is actually mostly ineffective in our experience. And so one of the things I would love to see personally is, before the internet, our companies were reliant on HVAC, plumbing, electricity, and we had an entire trade program in high school. So you could choose to go down that path. And one of the big issues I see is we watch folks come out with a cybersecurity degree from college. We interview them, and they have zero fundamentals in IT. And you can't do cybersecurity well, in my opinion, until you actually master the fundamentals. It's hard to be a lead at anything without a complete mastery of fundamentals. And I really think we need a real focus at a national level in our education system at building more IT professionals, because I think a lot of times this job, it's very technical, but it has a lot of similarities to, high-end electricians, extremely technical, right? And I think we need to build the capacity to have the talent, because what I notice is we have a huge amount of talent on paper with a big loss of fundamentals. And to get great at defense, it's also good to have a strong sense of offense, but it's illegal to do it for real.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you end up with this kind of chicken and egg scenario.
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%, and it brings two additional points to mind. One is, offense gets to move first, right? And offense gets to adapt first, and so the defense is always going to have to adapt, right? What's the solution today is not going to be what's the defensive solution today is not going to be the defensive solution tomorrow, because we're going to have to adapt to what the adversary is doing, right? And then the other point, which I think is really, really important, is at senior levels in companies, it's very important that the seniors understand cyber well enough to think about the risks associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been on some boards where, there was a view, unstated view, but you could feel it in the room. Because we have Michael here, we got cyber covered. Right.
And box checked.
And I would say, guys, right? We all understand different financial risks to the company, right? We all understand different geopolitical risks to the company, right? Well, we all need to understand the cyber risks to the company, right? We all need to appreciate that. And at the end of the day, it's no different than any other risk that the company faces. You need to understand it. You need to figure out how to mitigate it, and you need to how to, monitor that mitigation, and move on with your business, right? But the entire leadership team, the management team, the board, all those people need to understand it well enough to be able to make decisions about it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's at the end of the day, especially with ransomware, which we see as the most prevalent threat, the kind of extortion game.
Right.
It's a continuity of operations issue. Step one. The integrity of your data is kind of step two. That's also incredibly important. But the thing that can take you out almost overnight is a massive kind of ransom event. And I think it's really important that companies and specifically senior leaders in companies understand that is the one threat that can, cause immense pain really, really almost faster than any other avenue. And so,
Right.
If you do it right, it can turn into an advantage for your business too. I think that's
absolutely
a kind of a security first mindset. So, big picture, you have more experience than most folks that have come out of the intelligence services. If there's 3 national security priorities that you would advise the president to focus on, what would they be?
It's a great question.
That could go a lot of ways.
It's a great question. Look, number one is China.
Right.
And I think the issue for China is we have to figure out what we can live with. So we cannot contain China the way we contained the Soviet Union. Right. The Soviet Union had no economy. It was possible to contain them.
Right.
That's not possible with China. China has much more power today than it did 20 years ago, and there's a debate about whether they're a peak power now or whether they're continuing to grow. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But they're going to have a lot of influence in the world.
Right.
Going forward. So we got to figure out of their behavior in the world, what can we live with and what can't we?
Right.
And then we got to sit down and have a conversation with them. But we say, this stuff is okay.
Right.
This stuff is not. And on the stuff that's not, here's how we're going to push back against us. And by the way, all of our allies are with us.
Right.
I don't think we've even thought through that part of it yet. So for me, China is about not winning some competition here because that's not possible.
No, yeah, I agree.
It's about managing this relationship in a way that maintains stability in the world and allows both countries to benefit economically. Right? That's what we have to get to. And I fear, John. So one of the ways I think about China is this spectrum of where U.S.-China relations can be. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got cooperation, like we saw between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping on climate change during Barack Obama's last year in office.
Right.
I mean, they struck that climate change deal. It's fantastic. You move over on that spectrum and you get to what I call healthy competition, right? Healthy economic competition, healthy diplomatic competition.
Right.
But then you move over on the spectrum and you get to what I call unhealthy competition. So the Chinese stealing intellectual property, right? The Chinese doing forced tech transfer. The Chinese militarizing the South China Sea, right? All of this stuff that's
loan sharking poor countries' port infrastructure.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
All of that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Unhealthy diplomatic competition, all of that stuff. And then at the far end of that bad spectrum is actually war.
Right.
Right? I mean, the probability of war between the United States and China, it's not high, but it's not zero.
Right.
It's not zero. Probability of war between the United States and Canada is zero.
Right.
Right. It's not with China. So, if you sat American leaders down with Chinese leaders and said to them, "Where do you want to be on the spectrum?" They'd all want to be down at the good end of the spectrum.
Right.
But I think that nationalism in China and now politics, now joined by politics in the United States, I can't find a single person on Capitol Hill who's willing to say anything nice about China.
Right.
Even panda bears, right?
Right.
Politics and nationalism in China, politics here is dragging us in the wrong direction.
Right.
On that spectrum. And that's the ultimate China challenge, I think, is how do we live with this country, not how do we prevent it from becoming a global power, because we can't do that.
Yeah, they're
already
there.
are.
They're there.
They're already there.
I think they're a lot more than a lot of people understand, too, in the United States.
Yeah. And then I'd say, too, is Russia. For one reason and one reason only, that a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia could destroy civilization, literally. So, this talk by Putin about the use of nuclear weapons is extraordinarily dangerous.
Right.
The fact that the Russians have in their military doctrine the use of tactical nuclear weapons is extraordinarily dangerous.
Right.
And so even though they're dying as a country,
Right.
and what Putin has done in Ukraine is gonna deepen and steepen their decline even more. As long as they have nuclear weapons, our relationship with that country is incredibly important.
Right.
And the third thing I'd say, and this is going to sound very odd,
Right.
the third thing I'd say is our own politics.
Mm-hmm.
Back to what we talked about before. So at the end of the day, a country's national security is more dependent on a country's economic success than anything else.
Right.
And so if we can't be successful economically and we can't have a healthy society, you can forget about all the national security stuff.
Right.
And as long as our politics are broken, we're not going to be able to make decisions that move our economy and our society forward. And that scares me a lot. I ran into a very senior member of Congress who I used to brief when I was deputy director. He's no longer in government. I ran into him recently and I said, sir, are we going to see you back in government anytime soon? Back in politics anytime soon? And he laughed and he said, Michael, this is not my politics. I could not get elected today. And then he said something that really scared me. He said, what I don't know is this a brush fire, right? That's going to blow itself out in 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Right.
Or are we going to be stuck in this deep populism, right? That's and this deep division for the next 25 years. He said, I don't know the answer to that question.
I know we talked about it a little bit before we started recording, but I think the one interesting thing coming out of the intelligence communities is you learn a lot about humans and other countries as well. One, when you watch people and they never know they're being watched, you learn a hell of a lot about human traits.
Yeah,
you
sure do.
You see the real beast under the hood.
Yeah,
but two, you watch the start of traits in countries that start crumbling. And I think to the brush fires that, more of a dumpster fire, a bigger forest fire, like that's the disconcerting part, because there's not a lot of sports teams out there that win when half the team hates the other half. And when we're dealing with, a weakened Russia that is still armed to the teeth with world-ending nuclear weapons, which is true, and then a China who's turning into an economic powerhouse who's also heavily investing in upgrading their nuclear weapons. I mean, obviously, I'm not in the community anymore, but I can read enough in open source press to know they are putting some significant investment, specifically in their ICBM forces.
Yeah, they sure are.
And I was always struck with, even in our own nuclear weapons complex, there is a certain amount of production capacity and need to continue to innovate, or you're slowly always dying and falling behind. And I think that's another area. It's not popular to talk about, but from my experience, I think if you're not innovating or growing, you're in the state of dying. And I do think we're massively underinvesting, in my opinion, in our national labs infrastructure and our top weapons complex.
Absolutely we are. And every president now for multiple administrations has been told that, and we haven't made a decision to do the right thing yet.
Yeah, it's well, Michael, your career and service to our country is unmatched and most impressive, and I really enjoyed the chat with you today. And I thank you so much for being willing to spare an hour of your time to chat with us.
No, John, it was great to join you, and love to do it again sometime.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.